Hi, class. This is the third lesson of Unit 3. This will sum up Washington's presidency and talk a lot about his legacy. And it's also going to talk about the next two presidents to follow after Washington. We'll go through the term that John Adams serves as president and talk about some of the conflicts that happened there. And then I'll talk about the first term of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, which is going to end up being a lot more successful than his second term. So let's begin, though, by talking about the end of Washington's presidency. Washington is going to end his presidency with a series of warnings to the American people that are going to be collected in what is known as his farewell address. He's basically going to see what he sees as early problems in this brand new country and is going to give warnings to the American people to avoid being ununified, to avoid political parties, to avoid getting involved with foreign wars. He's going to continue to promote neutrality. Despite his warnings, problems will continue, both in terms of political division, one political party trying to have power over other political parties, and you will see foreign policy problems continue under both Adams and Jefferson. We will not get to the War of 1812, though, so Washington is going to survive his presidency without having the War of 18 or a war break out. So will Adams and so will Jefferson. However, as you'll see in the next lecture, by the end of Jefferson's presidency, we are on the brink of another war with Britain. So the War of 1812 is coming, haven't gotten there yet. So when Washington leaves office, he's going to give the American people his farewell address. And there are three major themes in his farewell address that I would like you to specifically know about. The first one is going to be what he considered to be a danger of sectionalism. You need to underline that word, sectionalism. That word is going to come up again and again. Sectionalism will be the cause of the Civil War over the issue of slavery largely, but slavery caused sectionalism. So what is sectionalism? It's whenever parts of the country care only about that part of the country rather than the country as a whole. For example, at this point, if you were to ask someone where they were from, they would probably say their home state. They wouldn't say, I'm from the United States. They'd say, I'm from North Carolina. I'm not from the United States. I'm from Virginia. And so people tended to care a lot more about their own area of the country rather than the country as a whole. And so Washington is going to call for unity. He knows that Northerners care more about the North than the country as a whole. He knows that Southerners care more about the South than the country as a whole. But he's going to say to the American people, look, you guys, as a nation, you all got together and got your independence from Britain. We are one big American family, if you will. We've fought, and some of us have died. Some of us have shed blood to create this country. We should remember to care about this country as a whole, not just our particular section of the country. So again, put a little star next to the definition for sectionalism. You'll need to know that going forward. Basically, the Civil War will be caused because sectionalism becomes such a big problem. Another thing dividing the nation at this point, even though Washington wasn't part of any of the political parties, he knew that political parties had formed. He knew that people within his own cabinet were leading different parts of or different political parties. He knew that Thomas Jefferson was a leader of the Democratic Republicans. He knew that Alexander Hamilton was a leader of the Federalists. Why did he put them both in his cabinet? Because he thought that they were the best people for the job. He didn't care about which party they were in. However, more and more people started to care about political parties rather than the country as a whole. And he's going to say, look out for political parties, because what political parties will do is they will seek power for themselves, even if it hurts the country. He's going to say things like politicians will try to divide the American people in order to get votes for themselves and for their political party. And if you look at politics today, it's the Republicans that don't seem to be able to say anything good about Democrats. Democrats don't seem to be able to say anything good about Republicans. And it does divide the country very noticeably in this day and age. But again, he's going to talk about not only political parties being divisive, but the fact that political parties ultimately want power instead of what's good for the nation as a whole. He's going to say that oftentimes these political parties are corrupt. And you will see in the very next president's term under Adams a political party perform a power grab, and do some unconstitutional things in order to keep power for themselves. That will be when the Federalist Party passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, which I'll get to later on. The other major danger that George Washington warns against is forming any foreign alliance. He says we should not have an alliance with Britain. We should not have an alliance with France. The only thing that we should do in connection with other countries is trade. We sell them stuff, we buy things from them, but we don't form any military alliances. He knew that if we were to form a military alliance with a country and that country got into a war, then that could potentially drag us into a war as well. And George Washington knew that the country was stronger than it had been under the Articles of Confederation, but we were still really a baby country at this point. And we really were just starting to take our first steps. And if we stumbled into a war with our first steps, then we would not last very long as a nation. And we are able to avoid wars for a little while after his presidency, although ultimately we will end up getting pulled into the War of 1812. That was a hard one for us to avoid. I'll talk more about that in the final lecture of this unit, which is the next one. So there are the three major warnings that Washington gave to the United States. Now, what is his legacy overall? Well, the first thing is that Washington did help strengthen the federal government. For example, he authorized Hamilton to create his financial plan, which did strengthen the economic stability of the United States government. He also passed a test of the federal government. When the Whiskey Rebellion broke out, there was a question over whether or not the country could survive rebellions. It could barely survive rebellions under the Articles of Confederation. But remember that with a new, stronger federal government, Washington had shown that the federal army was strong enough to put down rebellions. So the Whiskey Rebellion and Hamilton's financial plan are the two best examples of how Washington strengthened the federal government to create a stable new government going forward. Perhaps Washington's biggest legacy, though, is the fact that he served for 2 terms only and then retired. Now, he could have run for a 3rd term, and despite things like Jay's Treaty being unpopular, he probably would have won a 3rd term. He was a very popular American. People almost looked at him as like a god among men. Some people did. So he could have served for a 3rd time. He could have served until he died. But instead, he voluntarily retired. Now, very rarely in the history of the world has someone had so much power and been willing to give it up. And this is actually the 3rd time he had given it up. He had helped win the Revolutionary War as a general. He could have become a military dictator at that point. He did not. He stepped aside. And then when the country started to fall apart under the Articles of Confederation, people basically begged him to help lead the Constitutional Convention, which he did. And then he tried to step aside again. And then, almost against his own will, he got elected as the first president of the United States, and then stepped aside. Now, around this time, a little bit later on, you're going to see the rise of Napoleon. He's going to be a leader in the French Revolution, but unlike Washington, Napoleon will never voluntarily step aside from power. And if I remember correctly, Napoleon even said on his deathbed that, quote, they wanted me to be another Washington. So probably Washington's greatest contribution is that he basically had the temptation, had the opportunity to be a dictator or like a king for the United States, and at every moment that he had that chance, he stepped aside. He did not cling to power. And this is going to set the precedent for future presidents, and only one president is ever going to serve for more than 2 terms ever in the history of this country, and today it's not even legal anymore. You have pretty much a maximum of 2 terms. That the fact that he was willing to give up power is one of the most important things that Washington did as president. And he also finally is going to establish a foreign policy of neutrality. Neutrality is a lot harder to work with these days, in the days of intercontinental ballistic missiles and the threat of World War III, but in the 1700s it was a little bit more realistic to try to be neutral. There were thousands of miles of ocean on either side of the United States, and that protected us from direct involvement with a lot of conflicts. And he is going to say, you know what, Britain and France, they're having their war. That's their problem. We'll try to trade with both of them, but we're not going to form an alliance with either side. We're not going to pick sides. We're going to try to stay out of wars. We're too young of a nation to get into wars. And our country will try to follow this neutrality policy. Adams will attempt it and struggle with it. Jefferson will attempt it and struggle with it. And by the time we get to the fourth president, James Madison, the writer of the Constitution, we will, by his presidency, get pulled into the War of 1812. But for a while, we are going to stay neutral. So the election of 1796 comes along, and this is going to be the first election where there's actually two main candidates. And the election results are going to be, as you see on the screen there. I'll explain it. So John Adams is going to run for the Federalist Party. Alexander Hamilton, another Federalist Party leader, wasn't eligible to run, arguably, because he wasn't born in the United States, and that is considered to be one of the requirements for becoming president. So John Adams steps in. And John Adams had actually been George Washington's vice president, so it kind of made sense. He already had some experience working with President Washington for him to become the next president. Notice, though, who the vice president is. Author of the Declaration of Independence, ex-Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. But also notice that they are in two different parties. Adams is a Federalist who favors the North more, who favors Britain more, who favors a strong federal government more. And then you have Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, who is a Southerner, who favors smaller government and more state power, and favors France. So how did this happen? Well, in 1796, the Constitution was written so that the person that got the most electoral votes became president, and the person that got the second most electoral votes became vice president, and it didn't matter what party they were in. In fact, the Constitution says nothing about political parties. Eventually, there will be an amendment to the Constitution to fix this sort of problem, because you can imagine that if the president is in one party and the vice president is in another party, they're probably not going to work too well together. So this is a rare moment in American history where the president and vice president are in different political parties. And if you look at the election map, you can see that the North largely went to the Federalist candidate Adams, and the South and the West went largely to the Democratic Republican candidate Thomas Jefferson. So Adams is now the president. If you look at the chart here that's coming up, in the middle oval, put events during Adams' presidency. Again, in the middle oval, put events during Adams' presidency. And they're kind of paired together. So the XYZ affair will lead to the Quasi-War, which I'll explain. The Alien and Sedition Acts will lead to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which I'll also explain. So again, we're talking about, and put this in the middle oval, events during Adams' presidency. So president number 2, one of the people that was a founding father. He helped write the Declaration of Independence, even though he wasn't the primary author. He had even been involved in the Boston Massacre court decision as a lawyer for the British troops. Now he's president. And he's not going to have the most successful of presidencies, but we'll talk about that now. So the first thing that happens is the XYZ affair. What ends up happening is in the aftermath of Jay's Treaty, France is upset. Now, I already told you about how Spain was concerned with Jay's Treaty with Britain, and how Spain had offered us Pinckney's Treaty as a way to kind of be nice to us. France reacts to Jay's Treaty much more angrily. Now, remember that British impressment of American sailors, the kidnapping of American sailors, had led up to Jay's Treaty. And France is basically going to say, well, if Britain can capture American ships and get away with it, then we will too. Now, France doesn't go so far as to capture and kidnap the sailors, but they are going to capture the ships. Still, this could lead to a war. And remember that John Adams is president. He is a Federalist. The Federalists don't side with France. Britain and France are still having their war. The United States is still trying to trade with both nations, and it's not working out so well. So Adams is going to send some diplomats to France, hoping to avoid war. And he's not going to send John Jay. I don't think anyone would have sent John Jay at this point, as unpopular as Jay's Treaty had been. So he's going to send a set of 3 diplomats over, and you don't really need to know who they were, but he's going to send 3 high-ranking American diplomats to France to try to avoid a war. Now, typically what happens during diplomacy, when diplomats meet with each other, they might try to wine and dine each other, they might slip each other a little bit of money, they might buy each other some meals, just to kind of grease the wheels of negotiation, if you will. What ends up happening when our diplomats arrive in France is going to be a slap in our face. It's going to be an insult, and that will be known as the XYZ affair. There will be 3 French agents whose names are not known, so they're just referred to as Mr. X, Mr. Y, and Mr. Z. And they're going to go before the American diplomats and say, before you can even talk to our diplomat, you must give us a $250,000 bribe. And $250,000 back then, even today is a lot, but back then would have been a whole lot of money. And to demand such a high level of money just to start negotiating was an insult. And our diplomats leave France angry, and no negotiations take place. And if negotiations don't take place, diplomacy doesn't take place, then that could lead to a war. And in this picture, what's being shown here is the United States is being shown as this woman that's being kind of made fun of and taken advantage of by the French. In this cartoon, you see something similar. You see our diplomats here, and then you see the XYZ people here, and they're kind of shown almost like a big monster, being very threatening, being very aggressive in their demands for money. And if you look here, you can see it says here, money, money, money. And so, and then if you look at the back here, you can see how the French are being shown as being kind of uncivilized, beheading the head of people that are dressed as if they were civilized. Just in general, people become very anti-France at this point because of the insult that came from Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z. So the American diplomats return back to the United States. Nothing has been solved, and we are furious. And a lot of Americans, mainly the Federalists, who were already anti-French, they're going to want to have a war. And remember, John Adams was a Federalist, and his own political party is calling for war right now. So what's John Adams going to do? Well, luckily, he won't listen to his party, his political party. What we do, though, is we start to retaliate by capturing French ships. So the French are capturing our ships, we're capturing their ships, and eventually our ships start to fire upon one another, and we have what's known as the quasi-war. This quasi means kind of like fake or not complete, and so this was not an official war. This is more of a scuffle. This is kind of like if 2 people want to get in a fight and they kind of shove each other and yell at each other, but they don't actually throw any real punches. That's kind of what the United States and France are going to do at each other. Our ships are going to fire upon each other a little bit. I'm not sure how many people died, if any. John Adams right now could easily have gotten Congress to declare war on France, but he remembered what Washington said, and he remembered the danger of getting pulled into a war. He said, let's do whatever we can to stay neutral. Now, around this time, Napoleon will rise to power in France, and he's already trying to fight a war against Britain. He doesn't want to have to worry about a war against the United States as well. And so he's going to basically say to Adams, he's going to say, if you send your diplomats back, we promise to treat them with respect, and we can settle this whole issue peacefully. And Adams, despite the fact that the Federalist Party wanted to have an all-out war with France, is going to agree. And so what happens is that the United States and France are going to avoid war by signing a treaty known as the Convention of 1800. So at this point, things cool down between the United States and France, and that's a very important thing to note, because in a few years, we are going to want to buy something from France and from Napoleon. And because Adams smoothed things over so well in 1800, 3 years later, we're going to get a very good deal when it comes to the Louisiana Purchase. And I'll get to the Louisiana Purchase by the end of this lecture. So at this point, the United States and France officially are not going to go to war. Officially, the diplomats have kind of smoothed things over. But that doesn't mean that people in the United States exactly like the French right now. And that's going to cause some problems. Now remember that even though Adams had risen to the occasion to maintain neutrality and smooth things over and avoid war, the members of his party in Congress, the Federalist Party, they're going to try to use this anger at the French to pass some laws that really amounted to a power grab for the Federalist Party. Now, note I told you earlier that Washington had warned that political parties sometimes seek power. Instead of doing what's good for the nation, they do what's good for their political party. So, what the Federalist Party does is they pass a series of laws that are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what this is going to do is going to be aimed to give the Federalists more power, give the Democratic Republicans less power, and also hurt anyone that wanted to immigrate from the United States to from France to the United States. Why would they go after people immigrating from France to the United States? Because once these people became American citizens, they would probably vote for Democratic Republicans. Remember, Democratic Republicans and the French got along, or had agreed with one another a lot more often. So the Alien Act is going to go after French immigrants. It's going to make it much harder to become a citizen. It's going to make the year qualification for becoming a citizen jump from 5 years to 14 years. So it's going to make it practically impossible for French immigrants to become Americans. And also the Alien Acts are going to make it a lot easier to deport people. Especially they target deporting French immigrants so that they can never become citizens and therefore never vote for Democratic Republicans. Basically, the Federalists were using this anti-French feeling to get rid of anybody that could in the future vote against the Federalist Party. This was again a power grab. On top of that, the Federalist Party is going to pass what's known as the Sedition Act. And it's going to make it illegal to speak against the government publicly, to write against the government publicly. There are going to be some newspaper editors that are going to be arrested under the Sedition Act. That should raise some eyebrows, because that is a blatant violation of the First Amendment, of freedom of expression, of freedom of the press, of freedom of speech. So the question is, why is the Supreme Court not doing anything about this? And the answer basically is that the Supreme Court had not yet asserted its authority to check the power of Congress and to declare its laws to be unconstitutional. I'll talk more about when the Supreme Court asserts itself later on. So this is going to get very tense in Congress. If you look at the picture there, it's showing people in Congress actually fighting and trying to beat each other up in Congress. So if you think Congress is bad today, you should have seen them back in the late 1700s when they were fighting for power, sometimes violently. So in the end, the Alien and Sedition Acts really amount to a power grab for the Federalist Party. They're using anger at the French to get more power for themselves. And then why do they target the French? Not really because of what had happened with the Quasi-War, because things had been smoothed over. They're doing this because they're attacking the French people that come to the United States, become American citizens, and would then vote for Democratic Republicans. So basically the Federalist Party is trying to kill off the Democratic Republican Party. And if you had a problem with this, if you thought that this was a power grab from the Federalists, if you thought this was unfair or unconstitutional, and you said so publicly or printed it in a newspaper, well, the Federalist government or the Federalist Party would say that you can't criticize us. And what's interesting is that the Federalist Party, when they made this law, put an expiration date on that law for the next election. Just in case they lost power, then they would be allowed to criticize the government. But so long as the Federalists were in power, they were going to make it illegal to criticize the government, which is a blatant violation of the First Amendment to our Constitution, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And this is only a couple of years after Washington left office, and already his warning that political parties seek power and they can often be corrupt and not look out for the country and the good of the people, but just look out for power for themselves. This is already happening, and Washington is still alive to see this happen. And this is also going to confirm the fears of a lot of Democratic Republicans that giving the federal government too much power and the states too little power can lead to dictatorships. Basically, the Federalist Party is acting like a dictator party right now. So this leads to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And I would recommend that you highlight this entire final box on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, because this is going to be a very important thing. It's going to introduce an important concept called nullification, and it will foreshadow the Civil War. So when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, you did see a couple of states, state governments, basically pass resolutions or official statements condemning the Alien and Sedition Acts. You're going to have the Virginia Act, the Virginia Resolution and the Kentucky Resolution. These were written by James Madison, who was, I believe, Secretary of State at this point, and by Thomas Jefferson, who was Vice President to John Adams. So as John Adams' Federalist Party is abusing its power and putting way more power in the hands of the federal government, you have the Vice President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, criticizing the Alien and Sedition Acts and saying that they are unconstitutional. So here again, you see this power struggle between states and the federal government. Now remember that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution has said that if a power is not specifically listed for the federal government, that power automatically goes to the states. So we've already seen before, and we're seeing it again, and we'll see it again in the future, this tension between the federal government and state governments. And at this point, there will be a new idea introduced called nullification. You must know what nullification means. And this is going to lead to, eventually, the American Civil War, though not yet. So nullification is the idea that if a state disagrees with a federal law that they find to be unconstitutional, they can basically reject it and ignore it. You kind of see that today with the fact that the federal government has made marijuana illegal under federal law, but certain states are legalizing marijuana to varying degrees. But that's a much less serious situation than what you see here in the late 1700s. But again, the idea of nullification, which every once in a while pops up, but not on real serious issues, the idea of nullification comes along during this time. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions basically say that if a state doesn't like a federal law, they can ignore it. And that, again, is known as nullification, to nullify a law. Star that one, highlight that one, make sure you know what that means. Why is that a big deal? Well, this is not going to be the only time that states challenge the power of the federal government. In the 1820s and 30s, you're going to see the state of South Carolina challenge a tariff that the federal government had passed, and that almost leads to violent conflict in South Carolina. In the end, that does not become a big issue. Or it is a big issue, but it's temporary. And then the biggest issue regarding nullification will be the coming of the Civil War. So in the 1860 election, the federal government is going to be seen by the southern states as a threat to slavery. And the southern states don't want the federal government to take away their slavery, and they are going to basically nullify the results of the 1860 election. They're going to say that the federal government has been hijacked by anti-slavery people like Abraham Lincoln, and they are going to try to break away from the country. That's called seceding from the Union, and we'll talk more about that whenever we get to the Civil War. But again, basically, you again see this tension between states and the federal government, and this power struggle will be an on-again, off-again issue leading up to the Civil War. Now, it does not create civil war at this point, largely because most people see the Federalist Party for what they're doing, and they're going to vote the Federalist Party out of office, and the Alien and Sedition Acts are going to expire on their own. But this could have been a bigger issue had these Alien and Sedition Acts not expired. So, again, out of the Alien and Sedition Acts comes a reaction from some states known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which introduced the idea of nullification, the idea that states can reject federal laws that they don't like. And eventually this idea of states versus federal government will lead to the Civil War when the southern states decide that they want to break away from the federal government, largely over the issue of slavery. And then the federal government is going to fight a war to keep them from leaving, to preserve the United States. More on that later. So when you get to the election of 1800, the Federalist Party has no chance of winning the presidency. They have no real chance of winning much power in Congress either, because most people see them as abusers of power. By this point, uh, George Washington has just died, but people have not forgotten his words, his warnings about political parties, and people are so mad at the Federalist Party that they are going to get very few votes. So in 4 short years, the Federalist Party has gone from having power to abusing their power to getting voted out of power. And that leads to the election of 1800, which will be a rematch pretty much between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And there will be a lot of mudslinging or dirty politics involved here. If you look at this cartoon here, you see a picture here, and this cartoon is saying that if you want a country that is like George Washington's country, that has like these halos from heaven shining down upon it, that is noble like a lion, noble like an eagle, has order and law and religious order, then vote for the Federalist. But if you vote for Democratic Republicans like Thomas Jefferson, well, there's storms up ahead, and I don't even know what kind of animal that's supposed to be. But basically, there is a lot of junk talking done during this election. It would make the election of 2016 look like child's play. They said things like, for example, that if Thomas Jefferson was elected president, then Christianity would be outlawed in the United States, which is absurd to say, but you did see that sort of mudslinging happening. So in the end, the top 2 vote getters are going to be Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. In fact, John Adams does so poorly that he finishes, I believe, 3rd. So he doesn't even fall in the first 2. So the top 2 vote getters are going to be Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So the question is, what happens if there's a tie? Or what happens if no one has the majority of electoral college votes? Well, the rule, according to the Constitution, is that the House of Representatives gets to decide who becomes president. And the House of Representatives at this point is still being run by the Federalist Party, although they're about to leave office. They've been voted out. They haven't actually left yet. And so the Federalist Party is going to decide who's going to become president. They're going to have to choose between pretty much Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And they don't really like either candidate, but Jefferson is going to be preferred over Burr. So what happens is you're going to have some backroom deals happen. Now, Alexander Hamilton, even though he couldn't become president, he was still a very influential politician in the House of Representatives, and he is going to be able to basically tell Thomas Jefferson that if Thomas Jefferson will keep the Bank of the United States, which remember was part of Hamilton's old plan, if Jefferson promises to keep the Bank of the United States, which, by the way, Jefferson didn't believe in, then he would make sure that Jefferson got more votes in the House of Representatives. What does Jefferson do? Does he stick to his ideas and say, no, the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional? Or does he say, I'll give up on that idea so long as I can become president? In the end, Jefferson is going to take the deal. And so Hamilton is going to use his influence to get the House of Representatives to make Jefferson the president. Aaron Burr becomes vice president. So again, political drama and political junk talking has been around since the beginning, despite Washington's warnings. So at this point, the man in the middle here, here's Jefferson, he becomes president. Adams here is going to go out of office. And the man on the right, that's Aaron Burr, he's pretty angry right now. He feels like he has had the presidency stolen from him because of the deal that took place between Jefferson and Hamilton. So this election of 1800 is going to be nicknamed the Revolution of 1800 because power went from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Party without bloodshed. This was really another test of the Constitution. There had even been rumors before this happened that the Federalist Party would take the army and surround the Capitol to keep the Democratic Republicans from taking over. However, they don't. And like it or not, John Adams leaves office, the Federalists leave office, they lose the presidency, they lose Congress, and the Democratic Republicans come in Congress and into the presidency, again with Jefferson being president. And to be honest, this revolution wasn't as big of a revolution as you might think. When Jefferson takes office, he realizes that some of the Federalist laws were okay. Not the Alien and Sedition Acts, but he's going to keep the Bank of the United States. He's going to keep some tariffs. Uh, he is going to basically keep all of Hamilton's financial plan except for the whiskey tax. Still, you have a new party in power, and so it still, in a sense, is a revolution. Now, keep in mind there's no love lost between Burr, who has, again, he feels like he's been robbed of the presidency, and Hamilton. And the two men are going to kind of talk junk about each other for a while, and then eventually Hamilton is going to he's going to run his mouth a little bit too much. Vice President Burr is going to decide to run for governor of New York, and Hamilton did not like that idea. I believe Hamilton was from New York himself, and he is going to talk junk about Aaron Burr in the newspapers, and eventually Burr is going to be so mad that he's going to challenge Hamilton to a duel. So when the duel happens, Burr is going to challenge Hamilton because they didn't like each other. So this is basically your ex-secretary of the Treasury and your vice president shooting at each other. Talk about political drama. So in this duel, there's a lot of speculation as to what actually happened. The witness accounts as to what happened do contradict each other, but the most popular story is that that Hamilton didn't really want to be in this duel, but he knew that he would be seen as a coward if he did not participate in this duel. And a lot of times what people would do in duels is they would basically both miss on purpose, but so long as a shot was fired by each side, they could say they had their duel and both could go home safely. So what happens is Hamilton deliberately shoots above Burr and misses him. Burr, on the other hand, according to the popular story, does deliberately shoot at Hamilton, and the bullet hits Hamilton in his hip bone and ricochets up into his torso and kills him. So Hamilton at this point, after a political spat that turned into a duel, the first Secretary of the Treasury, one of the people that was at the Constitutional Convention who had been a founding father, is going to die. His funeral was one of the biggest funerals in American history. In New York City, thousands, tens of thousands of people lined the streets as Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, was laid to rest. At this point, Burr is in trouble because dueling was illegal, and Burr, even though he killed Hamilton, Burr is also killing his political career, and he's never going to be elected to office again, and he's going to spend much of the rest of his life on the run or outside of the United States. But in the end, this is how the very influential Alexander Hamilton's life ends. So if you think politicians are mean to each other now, at least they're not challenging each other to duels like they did back in the 1800s. Okay, so, and by the way, when Burr does this, he is definitely no longer going to be Jefferson's vice president. Jefferson's going to have a different vice president in his second term, but we're not to Jefferson's second term yet. Okay, so let's talk about Jefferson and his presidency. So in the middle oval, put events during Jefferson's presidency. Again, in the middle oval, put events during Jefferson's presidency. And we'll start in the upper left section, then go to the upper right section, and then as the arrows indicate, what happens in the upper right section, the Louisiana Purchase, will lead to the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which is one of the coolest things to ever happen in American history, in my opinion. Okay, so Jefferson is now going to be president, and everyone's sitting around waiting for Jefferson's inauguration. And while that's happening, John Adams and the Federalists are kind of hatching a plot to try to keep the Federalist Party in power. Now remember, there are three branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial. And at this point, the president is now a Democratic Republican. And at this point, the legislative branch, the Congress, is controlled by Democratic Republicans. So there's only one branch left, and that the Federalists could have any chance of controlling. And so what John Adams does is he spends his last few days in office filling the judicial branch with Federalist judges. The idea was that if the judicial branch was full of Federalist judges, then anything Jefferson wanted to do could maybe be blocked by a Federalist judge, or anything that the Democratic Republican-controlled Congress wanted to do could be blocked by the judicial branch, by the Federalist judges, or by Federalists on the Supreme Court. So basically, one last chance to show that they're not power hungry, and the Federalist Party shows that they're power hungry again. And again, John Adams is going to appoint these judges to limit the power of Democratic Republicans and keep the Federalists in power as much as possible. So this is another power grab by the Federalists. By the way, the Federalists are never going to have a president again. John Adams will be the first and only Federalist president ever. They really blow it here with the American people with multiple attempted abuses of power to keep power for themselves. So whenever the Democratic Republicans came into power, when Jefferson was inaugurated and the new Democratic Republicans came into Congress, they tried to block the appointment of Adams's judges, which were nicknamed the Midnight Judges. And they were called Midnight Judges because of this idea that he had waited till the last second, almost like he had stayed up until midnight the night before Jefferson's inauguration to appoint these judges. And this is going to lead to a Supreme Court case, the first Supreme Court case that we talk about in this class, and that'll be Marbury versus Madison. And what Marbury versus Madison does is it rules on that Judiciary Act of 1789 that I talked about in the last lecture, and it's going to rule that basically part of it is unconstitutional. And the Judiciary Act of 1789 and the Marbury versus Madison ruling on that isn't the most important thing. The most important thing here is that this is the first time ever that the Supreme Court has made a ruling on a law that was created by Congress or an action that was performed by Congress or the President. In other words, the Supreme Court for the first time is showing that it can rule government actions or laws to be unconstitutional. So in your minds, you need to think Marbury versus Madison equals judicial review. Judicial review is the authority of the Supreme Court to rule a government law or action to be unconstitutional. If you look at this cartoon on the right-hand side, it's almost like you have a football game, and you've got one side of the line being the legislative branch, Congress, the other side being the executive branch, the President. But who makes sure that the game is played according to the rules? Who makes sure, look at the mouse, who makes sure that the game is played according to the U.S. Constitution? Who makes sure that Congress and the President follow the Constitution? That would be the judicial branch. That would be the Supreme Court. Marbury versus Madison basically establishes the Supreme Court as a referee for the other two branches of government. Had Marbury versus Madison taken place before the Alien and Sedition Acts, they probably would have ruled the Alien and Sedition Acts to be unconstitutional. There are other times later in history where the Supreme Court is going to rule things to be constitutional or unconstitutional. For example, in 1954, schools were segregated by race, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that to be unconstitutional, and because they did that, schools were integrated. In the 1970s, there's going to be a president of the United States, Richard Nixon, who gets involved in a scandal and tries to abuse his power as president to save himself from going to jail, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that the president is not above the law. So basically, there will be multiple times in our country's history where either the Congress or the president try to do something that is unconstitutional, and ever since Marbury versus Madison, for the good of the country, the Supreme Court has been able to stop such actions from taking place. That is extremely important to note. The Supreme Court has the final say on what is and is not allowed in this country according to the Constitution. Now, arguably in history, they haven't always made the best choice, but overall, this is a very important power to have to keep the other two branches of government in check. Okay, now let's talk about the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark Expedition, which are very interesting topics. So Jefferson takes office. And when Jefferson takes office, at this point, Napoleon has risen to power, and at this point, Spain, which owned, if you look at the mouse here, Spain had owned all of this area from right where the mouse is now, the Rocky Mountains. Spain had owned that all the way to the Mississippi River. Okay, this area here, which includes the Mississippi River and New Orleans, is known as the Louisiana Territory. Napoleon makes war with Spain. Spain ends up giving France the Louisiana Territory, and that's a problem because if you remember from the last lecture, Spain had made a deal with the United States called Pinckney's Treaty where we would be allowed to use the Mississippi River for trading, and we'd be allowed to use New Orleans, a port city, for trading. And suddenly it looked like we were going to lose all this. So Jefferson was very insistent, if not desperate, to be able to continue to use the Mississippi River and to be able to continue to use New Orleans. If we could not use the Mississippi River, then people really couldn't move west. Because if you are on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, like in this area here where the mouse is, there are no rivers that will take your products like cotton or corn or grains or things like that. There's no river that'll take you across the Appalachian Mountains to the ocean to trade with Europe or other nations. You have to have the Mississippi. There is no other real river you can use. And if you need to do the trading is going to take place at the end of the Mississippi River at New Orleans. So Jefferson is going to send diplomats to Napoleon, and Jefferson is going to give them permission to buy just New Orleans and access to the Mississippi River. Basically, have the same access to the Mississippi and New Orleans that the United States had had under Pinckney's Treaty for $10 million, which was a lot of money back then. Napoleon, however, wasn't too interested in holding on to the Louisiana Territory. He didn't want to have to worry about that big chunk of land in the New World, and he was running low on money. So Napoleon is going to strike an amazing deal with the United States. He's going to say, tell you what, not only will I sell you New Orleans and the Mississippi River for $10 million, for another $5, I'll give you the entire Louisiana Territory, and you can take that off my hands, and I won't have to worry about that, and then I get $15 million. Does Jefferson take the deal? Well, who wouldn't? This comes out to like 3 cents per acre. Even in today's money, this is one of the best land deals in the history of the world. And so the United States is definitely going to take this deal from Napoleon, who you see in the painting there. We, at this point, are not going to just be using New Orleans, not just using the Mississippi River, but we're going to own them both, which is going to be an enormously fortunate set of events for the United States. Not only that, but we literally double the size of the United States' territory. From this point, we don't just own land up to the Mississippi River, we own land past the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And not one drop of blood will be shed, and this is done for 3 cents an acre. Never before or since in American, or so far as I know, in world history, has so much land been given for so little of a cost. So Jefferson had pretty much no choice but to take the deal. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'll get to the interesting point in a moment, but there you see the Louisiana Territory. This is the amount of land that the United States received for 3 cents per acre. And not only does the United States get this land, which was full of lots of farmland, which the Democratic Republicans, remember, a lot of them were farmers, they loved this. It does not only come with all of this land, it also comes with the Mississippi River and the city of New Orleans. The next question is that we're going to ask ourselves is what's out there? And we're going to end up having an expedition to explore this area. But before I get to Lewis and Clark, let's ask ourselves something about the Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson believed that if you were going to do something, if the government was going to do something, then the Constitution had to say you could do it. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the president can buy land like Jefferson does with the Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson is going to decide to interpret the Constitution loosely. Now, again, his typical belief was that you should interpret the Constitution strictly, only do what it says you can do. If it doesn't say you can do it, then you can't do it. That's known as a strict interpretation. Sometimes you'll see the word constructionist. It means strict interpretation. Jefferson's going to say, I know this is not authorized by the Constitution, but come on, it's for 3 cents an acre. And so he does this without technically having authority from the Constitution. Now, is anyone going to be angry at Jefferson for doubling the size of the country for 3 cents an acre? No. No one's going to want to impeach him. No one's going to have a problem with this, so far as I know. This is one of the best deals that has ever happened in American history, and it falls right in the lap of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's first term goes very well. We don't have a war with France, and we double the size of the country for 3 cents an acre. So Jefferson's first term is extremely successful. And we do get along very well with France, which makes sense since he was a Democratic Republican. The Democratic Republicans got along with France. When we get to the second term, things are going to start heating up with Britain, and I'll get more to that later on. And Jefferson's going to fail pretty miserably when it comes to dealing with issues with Britain. But when it comes to France, things are going smoothly. We just doubled the size of the country for 3 cents an acre and got the Mississippi River and New Orleans, which is great for trade. We got great water access and great land access in this deal. The question then is, what is in the Louisiana Territory? So that brings us to the last section of the notes for today. So at this point, Congress is going to authorize a secret expedition known as the Corps of Discovery, and their mission is to explore the Louisiana Territory. And they are going to be led by a couple of men named Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. So it's known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. I can't remember how many people were on the expedition, but it wasn't just these two men. It was several dozen people, and actually only one person dies the entire journey, which is pretty amazing considering how difficult the journey was. And I think it was because their appendix burst or something. It wasn't because of a Native American attack or anything that could really be helped. So the mission. What is the mission of the Lewis and Clark Expedition? Well, they have several missions, but the number one mission, and you need to make sure you know this, is to find a water route that leads from the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That's the primary mission. Why are they doing this? For the same reason that Christopher Columbus had gone across the Atlantic Ocean. There's still a desire to get to the Pacific Ocean and to China and India to trade. And if there's a river that crosses all the way across the United States, then that's going to be great for trade, not just with Europe. We already have good trade with Europe. We can get to Europe through the Atlantic Ocean, either along the Atlantic coastline or through the Mississippi River. But we want to be able to trade with East Asia too. And if we can find a river that goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, then we'll have that trade. So when the Lewis and Clark expedition starts, they're going to start by going, if you look at the mouse here, they're going to start going up the Missouri River. And they're hoping that the Missouri River crosses the entire continent. In the end, it's going to end somewhere right around here at Great Falls. More on that in a moment. There were secondary missions. They were also supposed to conduct scientific research, find out what the soil's like out there, find out what grows well out there. If there are going to be farmers moving out there someday, then we need to know what kind of crops will grow there. We need to know about how often it rains, how fertile the soil is, what kind of animals are out there, what kind of plants are out there. In fact, there were some people that wondered if the woolly mammoth was still around and that they were roaming the Great Plains. No one from the United States had ever explored this area before. And so again, Lewis here and Clark here are going to lead this expedition. They're also going to do a little bit of diplomacy, and they're going to meet with whatever Native American tribes they run into. Now, they will be peaceful with these Native American tribes. I'll explain one reason why in a moment. But they will not be exactly respectful to the Native American tribes. They will refer to them as children. They will tell them that they have a new great chief, and that chief is the President of the United States, and that so long as they do what the great chief, the President of the United States, wants, then no harm will come to them. So they're going to be, they're not going to start any fights, but they're not exactly going to be friendly either. So what's one of the things that keeps them from being attacked? Well, part of the way along their journey, they're going to meet with a Native American woman and her husband. The woman's name, people typically say Sacagawea. I believe the accurate pronunciation is Sacagawea, but that's tomato, tomato. I'm going to go with Sacagawea. So Sacagawea, they will meet while they are in what is now North Dakota, and she is going to lead them on this expedition. She is a guide. She kind of knows her way around. She can speak the Native American languages. And what ends up happening is that whenever they come in contact with other Native American groups that might attack them, these Native American groups are going to look at the Lewis and Clark expedition and they're going to see Sacagawea, and she actually becomes pregnant and gives birth along the way. They're going to see that the Americans are treating Sacagawea well and with respect. And so she really helps them get through without being attacked by any Native Americans. So this will be a very difficult journey. When they reach the Rocky Mountains, they're going to also reach the end of the Missouri River, and they're going to find that there is no water route all the way over the American continent. So again, as a result, no water route is going to be discovered because it does not exist. Eventually, if you will, the United States will build a route via railroad, and that'll be the Transcontinental Railroad. That will connect us to the West Coast, but there is no river. So no water route's going to be discovered, so mission A will not work. They run into the Rocky Mountains. There's no river that crosses over the Rocky Mountains, and they actually barely made it out of the Rocky Mountains alive. They almost got caught in the winter and could have starved to death in the Rockies and all died. They did make it through just as the snow was starting to fall. However, they do make it across the Rocky Mountains. They do eventually find another river called the Columbia River, and they do float on to the Pacific Ocean. So they do make it to the Pacific Ocean, but there is no water route that takes them there. The Rocky Mountains get in the way. However, they are able to find new plants. They are able to find new animals along the way. The bison are going to be plentiful. There are estimates that there were over 30 million bison at the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They are going to discover, well, first they're going to hear kind of these stories of a bear that's bigger than any bear that's in the East, much bigger and more aggressive than the black bear. And they are going to discover the grizzly bear. And it's very interesting, the story of how they discovered the grizzly bear. And I do have that in a primary source activity that I'll probably assign. But basically, it never took as many bullets before to take down an animal as it took for this grizzly bear that was chasing them. So they do discover new plants, they do discover new animals, they do make contact with Native American groups, and overall the mission will be successful. They don't get the primary part of the mission accomplished, finding the water route, but they pretty much accomplish everything else. They do scientific research, they do meet with Native American groups, they do find out what groups are out there. If you look at this map here at the bottom, you can see a rough map that was drawn by, I think it was Lewis, I'm not sure, but they drew a rough map of their expedition. Here you can see where they had to cross over the Rocky Mountains, and then they finally made it all the way to the West Coast, the Pacific. Okay, so if you look now at the map at the upper right, you'll see that the expedition is going to boost our claims to another piece of land. Right here, this section here that I'm showing you with the mouse, this is known as the Oregon Territory. The United States and Britain both claim this territory, but by this point, we were sharing it. Eventually, we will be no longer willing to share it. And one of the reasons that we're not going to be willing to share it is that after Lewis and Clark map out this area, a lot of Americans are going to start moving into the Oregon Territory, and we're going to start saying that we are the rightful owners of it, and Britain needs to back off. That will happen later on. But what happens is once this area gets mapped out a little bit, and once Americans have moved out there, you will see more Americans moving out there as a result of, if you will, Lewis and Clark paving the way. And so more and more Americans are going to move out west, and eventually a new idea is going to be created known as Manifest Destiny. So you see here at the top it says Manifest Destiny foreshadowed. Manifest Destiny was this idea that Americans had a God-given right to take over the western part of North America. And part of the reason that we believe this is because we had mapped it out more than other countries had, and we started to move out there more than other countries. And again, so we're going to have this idea that this land belongs to us, And it will lead to conflict with Native Americans who are already out there. So if you look at this map here, finally, as I wrap up this lecture, you can see that the Lewis and Clark expedition is going to go up the Missouri River. They are going to cross over the Rocky Mountains. They are going to leave the Louisiana Territory and go into the Oregon country, or the Oregon Territory, which was shared again between Britain and the United States. And then they're going to find their way all the way to the Pacific Ocean and then eventually work their way back. And again, once this expedition takes place and we find out what's out there, more and more Americans are going to start moving to this area, and that is going to create conflict with Native Americans later on in American history. And one final note is that if you were to ask Thomas Jefferson where the future of the United States lay, he would not say so much in Europe. He would not say to look to the east back to Europe. He would say not to look to the old world. He'd say take a 180-degree turn, face the west. The future of the United States is not in the old world, it's in the new world, and we have only just begun to explore and settle there. After the War of 1812, you will really see the United States start to turn its back on the old world, start to form its own identity, and we're going to start to move west. But that won't go without problems. As we move out west, we'll have issues with countries like Mexico. We'll have issues with who owns the Oregon country or the Oregon Territory, and of course we'll have issues with the Native Americans. More on that in later lectures.